I want to move to the first section, fighting like a mother. As I said, we have three patient parents. The first one, I think a lot of people in the audience is very familiar with her name, Julia Vitarello. She has another more well-known title, which is Mila's mom. She founded Mila's Miracle Foundation when her daughter Mila was diagnosed with a deadly rare disease called Batten disease. Mila received the world's first personalized medicine together with the physician scientist Timothy Yu from Boston Children's Hospital, who will also give a talk later today. And later on, Julia also founded N=1 Collaborative and Everyone Medicine with the mission to transform the medicine to benefit more rare disease family and children.
First of all, thank you, Nanwei, and everyone at IXLs, and I'm sorry that I can't be there. I know some of you that are there, and I would have liked to be in person. But a lot of you have heard Mila's story, I think, but I do think that it's helpful to always show a very short video of my daughter, just 3 minutes, and then tell you a little bit of Mila's story, even if you've heard it before, because I think it sets the tone for how I'm thinking about individualized medicines in regards to like changing access to rare disease treatments. So with that, I think it would be great if you don't mind playing the 3-minute video to start with. Thank you.
Sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray.
So our daughter's name is Mila Virginia Makovitz. She was born on November 5th, 2010. When I think about Mila as an infant, I think about smiles and laughter and health and...
Half an hour after she was born, she was strong enough to hold on to my finger and I could almost pick her up off the bed.
When Mila was a toddler, she was a climber, she was a hiker, she was a runner.
How old are you, Mila? Here's our sugar high daughter.
Slide, slide, slide.
Very physical, always loved to ride a strider.
Nice, bug.
Play in the snow, go sledding.
Coming.
We noticed that Mila was getting stuck on her words. She would say, "Mommy, Mommy, I have to. Mommy, I have to," and not be able to continue. And then suddenly, around 3 years old, we started noticing that her feet were slightly unturned and she was walking strangely. And then at 4 years old, we noticed that she pulled books in close. And then around 5 years old, Mila's feet started moving really quickly in this strange pit-pattering way, and then she would fall back on her butt. And every time she stood up, she would fall back and stand up and fall back. You know, we took her around to different doctors who never could really kind of figure out what was going on with her. And then time passes, and then in just 1 month, everything can change. She could no longer see anything. What's brought her so much happiness is playing with her toys and or looking at her books and watching TV and playing with her brother, and suddenly it looked like she could no longer play with anything. It's so hard to see such an outgoing little girl not be able to play with other kids and not be able to play with toys and not be able to watch Elmo anymore. I started, let's say, Mila's kind of story began and our life began in a way that was very typical, which I know is not always the case in rare disease. But I think her life resonated with many people because she was so typical and she didn't have any red flags. I was never in the doctor's office. She was actually very advanced verbally and physically. We live in Colorado, as some of you have probably heard, and Mila was skiing, at 2 years old. She was going up to the top of the mountain and skiing down. She was in a little rock climbing class when she was like 2.5. She was very into singing and memorizing all the words to Puff the Magic Dragon. And, I think she was like 3 years old or 2.5. She had like declared that her entire preschool make Puff the Magic Dragon like the, annual theme song for the whole school. She was very, very outgoing. And at 3.5, 4 years old, she started having problems. I carried around a tiny little piece of paper that I wish I still had right now, because I remember it said neurological symptoms with a question mark on it. And the little list got longer and longer. It started with the fact that she was like covered in bruises all the time, and she hadn't been before. It started, changing and becoming what's like question mark eyes. She got glasses. That didn't help. She started becoming really clumsy and falling. She started stepping on her toys. She was pulling all her toys and books into her face. And this list grew and grew between the age of like 3.5, 4 until 6. And I remember when I was thinking about talking today, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in a long time. When she was about 5 years old, I was exhausted because I had taken her to like 100 different appointments around the country, doctors and therapists. And I was so tired, and I had a newborn and 1.5, I guess a 1-year-old at that point. And she was climbing into the car and she wouldn't get in. And I just got so frustrated and was like, Mila, get in the car. It's so easy. And I remember her looking up at me and saying, like, Mommy, it's not easy. And I was thinking, like, how is this not easy? She's been like jumping into the car for the last 3 years. And now she's saying it's hard to climb into her car seat. So all of this kind of culminated at 6 years old with a visit for me. I just put her in the car and brought her to the ER at Children's Hospital, Colorado. And that I didn't go home that night. I stayed there for a whole week. And after a week of tests and eventually genetic testing, which was not the first thing that was done at the time, in 2016, I came back with a diagnosis, which at the time, I will be honest, was a huge relief, because I know many rare disease parents understand this, is like, I just had been told I was crazy by so many doctors and kind of poo-pooed so many times and been like, oh, she's fine, she'll grow out of this. And so for me to have an answer meant that maybe I could find a solution. But it took me like, 5 minutes Googling CLN7 Batten disease, which was a rare type of an already rare fatal condition, that it was like the worst diagnosis ever. I had doctor after doctor after doctor that I would find online and email tell me, I'm so sorry, that's the worst disease I've ever come across in the last 30 years. And it didn't take me long to realize that like no child had ever lived, and that I had a few years with Mila at most, and that she was going to lose all her abilities in the meantime. So like many of you and many parents out there, I just did whatever I could, and I read everything, and I reached out to every doctor and scientist, and I talked to a lot of parents, and the parents had lost their children and they were still fighting, and they had foundations. And that was a very pivotal moment in my life, where I realized that this might not be in time for Mila. In fact, there was little to no hope at all at that moment. I was told there was no hope, that if I was going to do this, it had to be for more than Mila. And these other parents were really, really inspiring. And so I started a foundation. I started working towards a gene therapy, because little to nothing was known about Mila's gene, where there were like 25 known cases, I think, in the world at the time. And along the way, I was also fighting another battle, which was that she had an autosomal recessive disease needing 2 mutations, and labs could only find 1. And I kept pushing Mila's poor, geneticist, that I kept pushing and pushing, and he was very wonderful and helped me ask more and more labs, and they couldn't find it. So I finally reached out via Facebook in a plea to get speedy access to whole genome sequencing through one of the very few labs at the time that did it. And that ended up not getting me to where I thought it was, but it got me somewhere even better. And it got me to Dr. Timothy Yu, who will be speaking later today, as Nianwei said, who works at Boston Children's Hospital. And he just, Mila's entire story took a turn at that point. And over the next year, he not only found the missing mutation, but it was at a time when Spinraza, which was an ASO for spinal muscular atrophy, had just been approved that same, I think, 4 weeks before. And so it was on everyone's mind. And all the neurologists were thinking of this as a pretty serious game changer in neurology. And lucky for us, that was on people's mind. And Mila started checking kind of all the boxes. Her disease, her mutation seemed amenable to a similar approach, but they couldn't find anyone else in the world that had the same mutation as Mila. So as you can imagine, a lot of people said, this is crazy. How can you make a medicine for one person? Luckily, Tim Yu, we wouldn't be here today talking about this if it weren't for he and his team that said, why not? And, you know, kept pushing through every open door and thinking maybe they would find a closed door, but they didn't. And within 1 year, a lot happened, of which I'm not a scientist, so I can't tell you, but I was involved in all of those steps along the way. And it was a Herculean effort involving hundreds of people across the world, academics, industry, regulators, that did an incredible job led by Tim Yu and his team to turn an idea for a Spinraza-like drug for one person into a drug called milasen, which was named after Mila. And we moved to Boston. And honestly, you know, we're at the 6-year mark as of a few weeks ago, which is kind of crazy. And until that day when Mila was receiving milasen, I really never had a moment to actually stop and breathe and think. And, you know, I'd been told a year before that no child had ever lived from this disease, that I was told by NIH researchers that we were 10 years away minimum from being able to come up with any treatment at all. And then here I was sitting in, you know, Boston Children's Hospital, and my daughter was receiving a medicine that was being injected to her brain, and it was targeted, highly, highly targeted to like her mutation, like the most underlying genetic cause of her disease. And I remember thinking, I couldn't even believe it happened. It's as if I didn't look up for an entire year to realize what was happening. In Mila's first year, I will say I was shocked because, I mean, Mila did so well. She was spiraling downward leading up to this. She was at a very progressed state. She had lost her vision. She had lost all her words. She had a G-tube to receive her, you know, her food, and all her nutrition and her water. She wasn't laughing and smiling as much, and she was really kind of crumpling when we were trying to walk with me holding her from behind. She was really kind of just not being able to lift her feet well and not sitting up straight and therefore not swallowing well. And everything was getting really difficult very quickly. And in that first year, I mean, it was pretty unbelievable. Like I remember seeing reports on Mila, and I couldn't believe I was looking at my own child's report. I mean, that she was like, it stopped, you know, it was for an entire year. Her seizures from 30 a day went down to nothing, sometimes 1 or 2 tiny little movements, but not, you know, arms thrashing and legs thrashing for 2 minutes straight, you know, in the 30 of them. And she started eating by mouth again, and it was pureed foods, and it wasn't perfect, but it was better for sure. And she was sitting up straight. And so that meant that I could hold her from behind and she could take steps up the stairs and she was just laughing, you know, at the same, she loved laughing at the times when in the books and the songs, when someone would sneeze or cry, and she loved crying baby. She thought that was hilarious. And she was doing that more, like noticeably more. So it was incredible. And then the second year, it was very unclear to me whether or not Mila was kind of stable or slowly declining. And then the third year was when COVID hit, and we lost a lot of support from people that were kind of helping us as well. And her disease was progressing independent of COVID. I could see that slow decline. It was significantly better than where she should have been. She was on 0.5 ml of one seizure medicine instead of 9 or whatever, you know, a lot of children with Batten disease have. So it was significantly helping, but I could tell that it wasn't in time. And that was a very, very excruciatingly painful year for me. And 3 years ago, which is so hard for me because it's 3 years this weekend, Mila, I just always like to say that her very big, beautiful spirit, you know, left her little tiny body. And I don't know how any parent does this. I don't know how anyone continues living after having to wake up every single day without your child. But the reason I'm here today and why I'm still here and why I'm still in this is because, you know, I feel like I carry Mila on my back. I used to carry her around everywhere on my back, and I feel like she's still on my back in some ways. And it reminds me all the time, I feel her, that I'm not alone in this, and that so many other people are going through this. And in fact, millions are going through this. And if you look at global gene statistics, which Nianwei pointed to earlier, you know, if you do the math and look at all those numbers and percentages, it comes to 60 million children will die before the age of 5 from a rare disease. And we can tear apart statistics all we want and say that they're not good. I don't really actually care if it's 60 or 40 or 20 or 10 million. It's still a massive number of children. And that doesn't even include Mila, who died at 10 years old. It doesn't include people that have, you know, children that have lifelong debilitating diseases. It doesn't include adults. And so as I appreciate, Nianwei, you using a phrase that I use all the time, which is, this is a global health crisis. There is no other way to put this. This is massive. And, you know, it keeps me up at night. I will say that we are in a very unique time right now. This was not true when Mila was diagnosed, but the reason we're in a unique time is because technology, the curve that we were supposed to see over those 10 years when I was told we were 10 years away from doing anything for Mila, has gone significantly uphill faster than we ever imagined. And what does that mean? It means that we have the technology today to find the Milas if we want at birth or in utero. And we have the technology to design medicines to treat them. Not all of them right now, but more and more and more, kind of by the day, by the month, by the year. And we, you know, milasen wasn't in time for Mila, but it did show what's possible. It showed that, you know, we have the technology to find her and to treat her, even if it wasn't, you know, unique to one person. And so it kind of points to, I think Mila's story points to a future of, instead of kind of the current system where you have one drug for hundreds of thousands of people, you have hundreds of thousands of drugs for 1 or 6 or 20 or 40 people. That is the direction that we're headed. The problem is that despite having this technology, it still depends on luck in order to access a treatment. And it's very, very simple in my mind. It's either you're lucky enough, and I hate to use the word lucky, but it's true. You're either lucky enough to be part of a large disease group that is commercially viable. So it's interesting to a company and they're going to develop a medicine for it, or numerous companies are, or you're lucky enough to be, you know, a child of a parent that's highly motivated, that's working with a highly motivated physician and is going to raise millions of dollars and get hundreds of people and rally them and push to, you know, have a one-off treatment. And so in my mind, I always picture kind of like the names of 60 million children on the left side. And then these technologies, which are developing and maturing, and a lot of them are becoming more programmable, meaning like the whole process stays the same. It's just the design of the medicine that's different. And you have these children, dying children in these technologies, and the only way to draw a line between them, so access to them, is whether or not you're part of a clinical trial that turns into eventually an approved drug that's for a commercially viable large population, at least 2,000, if not more and above, or this one-off sort of Herculean effort that's like a research or compassionate use IND. But in the middle, there's nothing. And that's where, you know, 99% of these people are falling. And, you know, over the years, I've been very fortunate to be part of thousands of conversations with the academics and the companies and the regulators and the payers and the governments and all this, you know, around this discussion, lots of really good conversations. But the problem is that here we are 6 years later, and accessing a treatment is not any easier. It's actually in many cases longer, harder, and more expensive than it was for Mila 6 years ago. So we're doing something wrong. And I think what I've kind of in the last year and a half realized is that, and this is kind of a little bold to say in front of lots of like scientists, probably and researchers, but that are in this crowd as well, is science isn't the limiting factor. It doesn't mean we don't have to work on it. And thank goodness for, especially for IXLs, who's really a critical piece of this, is that has to keep moving forward. But it isn't what's stopping the access. What's stopping the access is that we don't have the infrastructure and the processes that connect the patients to these technologies. And by that, what I mean is regulatory oversight, where it makes sense to have it and where it doesn't. Reimbursement, as Nianwei had pointed out earlier, both of these points. And I think the kind of like underlying foundation of these topics is the risk kind of benefit or the risk tolerance, especially when it comes to dying children with rare disease. So starting with regulatory, the way I see this is that right now, regulators have a system which they've kind of inherited over the years that is not, it's ill-equipped for this new paradigm. Science is changing, regulation, the pathway is not changing with how science is changing. And this paradigm is so different, it doesn't fit into the current system right now. And currently, regulators see every single step A to Z for every molecule. And the way I see this is regulators have a mandate. Their mandate is to protect public health, and protecting us from thalidomide and other scary drugs makes perfect sense. Everyone agrees with that. No one is going to disagree with that. However, there's another way to interpret protecting public health. And I think it's ensuring access to the technologies that exist today, independent of how many people could benefit from a medicine. And so if that's the case, of which I have found a lot of alignment on that in the UK, where their regulator, the MHRA, is very innovative and does think that that is their mandate. In fact, they think that if we continue doing things the way we're doing things now, regulatory pathwise, we are impeding access to technologies that exist today. There were no technologies before, but now there are. And the system is not allowing us to access them. And so then the question is how do we change this? There's lots of regulatory guidances and there's lots of attempts to try to fix this, but they're relatively small sort of renovations of the house. Whereas I don't think that we can renovate this house. I think we can keep the house. We don't need to knock it down, although sometimes I want to, but I think that it does its job, maybe for large kind of cohorts of people, but we do need to kind of build a house next door. And that house is going to look quite different, actually. And so what it means is that, you know, from A to Z, which of those steps should a regulator be having oversight over? Which of them are not needed? Where are there flexibilities in other parts of the FDA that we can pull from, or they can pull from, to justify that we have accredited centers, so that we're working, as long as you're working with an accredited center, and as long as you're working kind of within these guidelines, you can continue at scale, kind of getting patients to treatments as quickly as possible, submitting data, but not stopping, for example. There's a lot of small areas that could make a very big difference. Moving away from animal models, that's great to say that. I know it's very easy to say that, but there are actually mechanisms in place to be able to do that. And so I think we have to drastically change where there is oversight and where the regulator should be stepping back, the FDA should be stepping back. With reimbursement, you know, I think this is, and Nian Wei, I'm glad you brought this up. This is really important. Like right now, this is an individualized medicines is an academic endeavor. And this all falls on the heads of academics, and thank goodness that they're doing what they're doing. And there are 500 people in the N of 1 collaborative right now raising their hands because they either want to or are doing this. So there's a huge amount of interest, and they're working with parents who are selling, you know, lemonade and cookies to raise millions of dollars. This is all we have right now, but it's not scalable and it's not sustainable. And so for me, reimbursement is fundamental here, and having a viable business model is fundamental, because we need companies to be able to work with the academics together, like a full collaboration where each of them do what they do best. And physicians are finding patients and they're vetting them, and they're helping design, you know, the trials, and they are treating them, and they're monitoring them, and they're collecting the data and sharing it. That's critical. Companies are coming in with the money, because this is all great, but if you don't have the money, then no one's going to be treated, and we can't rely on parents to do this. And so they bring the money, they bring the drug development know-how and experience, you know, so we should be moving to that model. And the only way to do that is to drastically drive down the regulatory process and allow for reimbursement, which is not allowed right now. This is an academic research pursuit. In the UK, like I said earlier, I found a lot of alignment there. We are conducting a pilot there. And that pilot is specifically trying to kind of test the premise over the course of years, over the course of many patients and different diseases, different ASOs to start with. and trying to see how over the course of that pilot can we shift this regulatory path. So every few patients, how can we learn from that and change the process as we go? So by the end of a pilot of a number of years, we have a new regulatory path that's kind of has proportionate regulation, as they call it. And that we are also kind of figuring out what reimbursement financial model could work over the course of that, so that by the end we have a model that allows for reimbursement and gives incentives for more companies to be in this space, with the hope that there's a bustling ecosystem in a few years of many companies. I started one of them, Everyone Medicines, that's trying to create a business model where there is not one. It's impossible to have a business model today, but the hope is that we can set an example that will allow others, and we can help shift the regulatory and reimbursement. My hope is that there's this bustling ecosystem where there are many companies, many academics working to bring these individualized medicines, starting with ASOs, but moving on to other RNA therapeutics and gene editing, et cetera, that are all kind of programmable, and bringing them at scale. Because I think the biggest problem right now is at scale. We are doing this. There are more people doing this, but it is so hard and it is so slow. And unless we make these big changes, it's not going to happen at scale. The last kind of thought I want to share, and then I'm happy to have, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer any, is that, like I mentioned a minute ago, the base of this sort of house, if you want to call it, if we're trying to build another house for this new paradigm of individualized medicines, it is kind of the risk benefit or the risk tolerance. And it consistently blows my mind that I have friends who have lost their children, unfortunately, to cancer, and little children. And the risk tolerance that's already been established in end-stage cancer in children is there. But for some reason, we're sitting at the table and we're all getting around the table and saying, okay, let's sit down and start from scratch. What are we willing to do for a child like Mila that has 100% fatal disease? This does not mean, by the way, that children that don't have fatal diseases should not be considered here, but it's like the tip of the spear. It's where we're beginning. And children that have, like Mila had end-stage genetic disease. I don't know why we're not calling it that. That's what it is. She had end-stage genetic disease, and yet a girl her exact same age that has end-stage cancer can undergo not just chemotherapy, which already obliterates your system, but that's more well established, a very highly experimental cancer treatment like CAR T or others, where the risks are very high. At most, you're hoping in those cases to maybe buy that child a number of months, maybe a year. And society has already accepted the risk for those children and the willingness to spend a ton of money in hopes that it maybe gives that child a little bit of a better quality of life and a little tiny bit longer life. Sometimes can cure, but kind of rarely. And so we need to be able to use that same risk tolerance when we are talking about starting with, ASOs, and that will move over time. In the sense, you can stop an ASO, you can ramp it up, you can ramp it down. There are adverse effects. We know a lot of, we've seen trends of what they are. We are much better at monitoring for them. We can do MRIs, we can look for hydrocephalus, like we can do all of these things, and we can stop these, by the way. So unlike gene therapy and gene editing, we can stop these. So we've also had ASOs have been around for like 3 or 4 decades in animals and more recently in humans. So it blows my mind that we are on the other side of the Grand Canyon from children that have end-stage cancer, and what risk we're willing to take as society for them, and the regulators and the physicians and others are willing to take. So I think we need to, as parents, and those parents in the room, is really, really align on how we're talking about this, because it's up to us. It's us who the companies, the physicians, the regulators, everyone look to. And those of us that have children with fatal diseases really need to kind of stand up and kind of draw that connection between those two. So all of this to say, this is the most devastating world ever. I wake up every day feeling overwhelmed by how unbelievably devastating and how little is being done in some ways. I also wake up feeling extremely hopeful that a lot has been done, and that I kind of now feel like I can see the path forward. And there are few like the UK that are really pushing to make that drastic change. And there are companies in this space of which there are a handful only that I think are really, really trying to do this for the right reasons. And I think, Nian Wei from the top down has set just an incredible culture at iExcels for really being one of those companies that's, trying to survive and has to have a business model and also do the right thing. So I really appreciate that, Nian Wei, that you've brought these people together to talk about this, because you're the right person and iExcels is the right place to be having this discussion. And so as for my title, we can talk about scaling, but really what it means is how do we get from Mila to millions? And I think we can, but we're going to have to kind of all do it together. Otherwise, I'm going to be here giving the same talk in, 10 years. So thanks for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Question from the audience?
Can you say more about the pilot that we referred to in the UK, what the pilot is about?
Julia, can you hear?
It's very hard for me to hear that. Could you repeat it, Nian Wei? Or
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Oh.
The question. Do I need to come up?
Yeah, can you? Sorry. It's only for speakers.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for sharing your story with us and you're making the right points going forward. My question was, can you give a bit more details about the pilot in the UK you referred to? What exactly is that about?
I can give you a little bit, yeah. So at a high level, the idea was I went over there a year and a half ago, knowing that their former prime minister's child had died of a rare disease, and that since then the country has really hung their hat on genomics. They have a very unique situation in the UK that some of you might know, where they have, one system, the NHS, where all their clinical and now genomic data, as of recently with Genomics England, which is a company owned fully by the UK government, is sequencing 100,000 genomes and very recently has just started doing the newborns as well. And so the idea is they have all the clinical and genomic data in one place. They have a country that already really is proud of genomics and is kind of trying to spearhead it. They also just have the academic network of academic centers that have a lot of rare disease centers that are really highly motivated to do this. And most importantly, they have an extremely innovative MHRA in terms of the head of the MHRA. So meeting with each of these people, bringing them together, Department of Health as well, and working with them over the last year and a half culminated in a pilot, which is a very, very small scale pilot with a very specific framework around ASOs and children with fatal diseases to start with, and got really great buy-in from the government, including just a few months ago, all the way up from the Minister of Health, kind of approving this as something to move forward with, and they seem really proud of, which is very exciting. I would say I can't give a ton more detail except for to say why I think this happened and why it's different is that we can have thousands of conversations about how to do this. And we can have lots of intellectual conversations. In fact, there have been thousands of conversations about how to do this. But the premise behind this pilot was, isn't the best way to do this by drawing a circle around something very small scale to prove a model first, and then be able to kind of unroll it, roll it out if it were to work, and roll it out at a national level. Do this with a small kind of representative sort of companies, the Department of Health, Genomics England, the MHRA, et cetera, reimbursement as well, all in one small pilot to say, can we treat children, especially the ones that are dying and with ASOs, because it's the most mature modality, and can we use our experience to change the system over the course of the pilot, as opposed to just saying, we need to change the entire country, and this is how we're going to do it, because we don't know. The MHRA doesn't know how to do it. I don't know how to do this. The physicians don't know, but we do know the premises is that the current way of doing things is far off of where we need to be. And changing regulatory and changing reimbursement are the two things that we can learn from over the course of the pilot. So that was the purpose. In a way, I like to think of it as like a small little road crew that's trying to like pave a road or a highway with the goal that if we are successful, we open the road, and then the road is accessible for anyone, any academic, any company, anyone that wants to be on it, as opposed to trying to take on a national level massive change, which in the US would be I can't even fathom, but even in the UK would be hard to do, to bring all the clinicians on board, set expectations for all the families, change the regulatory process for the entire MHRA. This kind of small pilot allows, with the right premise, the right people decided to sit at the table and say, we don't know the answers, but we do know where we'd like to go, which is over here. Let's do this but by treating, learning, and sharing. So that's really critical, is that it's with iterative learnings with every single treatment is going back into this group to make sure that the next patient is done a little bit differently. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the overview.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much.
Thank
Wish you
you.
the rest of the day.